Have you ever noticed that some people can be wrong about almost everything and still never manage to say the words, "I'm sorry"? Not because they don't understand they made a mistake, because deep down, they usually do. At first glance, it looks like plain arrogance, like they simply think too much of themselves. But if you watch closely enough over time, something stranger starts to show up in the pattern. The people who avoid apologizing the most are often not the most confident people in the room. In a lot of cases, they're actually some of the most fragile people you will ever meet. Once you notice this pattern, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it in the people around you. Maybe you've experienced this yourself, more than once, in more than one relationship. Maybe there's someone in your life who has hurt you clearly, and instead of an apology, you got silence. Maybe instead of an apology, you got a joke or a sudden change of subject or a shrug. Maybe you've replayed the moment over and over in your head, wondering what you did wrong, even though, if you're honest with yourself, you didn't really do anything wrong at all. Maybe you've quietly made excuses for them, telling yourself that's just how they are. Maybe you've told yourself they don't mean it personally, even though it clearly felt personal to you. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you started believing that asking for an apology made you the difficult one. That's a strange kind of confusion to carry around, and a lot of people carry it silently. If conversations like this help you understand people a little better, consider subscribing. We explore one hidden psychological pattern like this almost every single week. Here's the surprising part of all this, once you actually stop and look at it closely. We tend to assume that people who never apologize simply don't care about the people they've hurt. We assume they think they're always right, and that's the only reason they never back down. But psychology often shows us something very different once you look underneath the surface. What looks like pride can actually be fear wearing a much louder, more confident costume. What seems like coldness may actually be someone quietly protecting something they can't even name themselves. For a lot of people who never say sorry, an apology doesn't feel like simple honesty. It feels closer to a small collapse, like the ground shifting suddenly under their feet. Let's slow down for a moment and look at how this actually plays out in everyday life. Think about a couple arguing over something small, like who forgot to pay a bill again this month. One person raises their voice first, and on the surface, the fight seems to be about money. But over time, it becomes clear they're not really angry about the bill at all. They're terrified of being seen as careless, the same way they were labeled as a kid. Now, think about a coworker who quietly takes credit for an idea that wasn't originally theirs. When it's gently pointed out in a meeting, they don't apologize, and they don't even pause to consider it. Instead, they explain, they justify, and they slowly turn the story around until you're the one on the defense. Somehow, by the end of the conversation, you're the one who feels unreasonable and a little dramatic. Think about a parent who raises their voice at a child during a stressful, rushed morning. Instead of saying sorry afterward, they simply move on, as if nothing had happened at all. Breakfast gets made, the car ride to school continues, and the moment is never named out loud. The child learns something quiet but powerful, that big feelings just disappear without ever being addressed. Think about a friend who cancels plans at the last minute, again, for the third time this year. Instead of acknowledging the pattern, they laugh it off before you even have a chance to respond. "I'm just like that," they say, turning a repeated letdown into a fixed, unchangeable personality trait. Think about a sibling who brings up an old fight every time a new one starts. They pile old wounds on the new ones, and somehow no single moment ever gets fully resolved. Think about a manager who criticizes a project publicly, then privately avoids the person for a week. The silence becomes its own kind of apology substitute, quiet, indirect, and never quite enough. Think about someone who forgets an important birthday, then gets defensive the moment it's mentioned. Instead of simply saying, "I dropped the ball," they list every reason their week was impossible. The explanation might even be true, but it quietly replaces the one thing that was actually needed. Think about a roommate who breaks something in the shared kitchen and never brings it up. Weeks later, you find the broken item hidden in a drawer, still unspoken and unresolved. Think about a partner who says, "I'm sorry you feel that way," instead of simply, "I'm sorry." That small phrase shifts the blame back onto your reaction instead of owning the original behavior. It sounds like an apology, but if you listen closely, nothing has actually been taken responsibility for. In every one of these situations, the surface behavior looks like plain, ordinary carelessness. But underneath, something a little more complicated is usually happening beneath that surface. Our minds naturally build a story about who we are, piece by piece, over many years. Psychologists have a term for this, but you honestly don't need the term to understand the feeling. For some people, that inner story was built around being the responsible one in the whole family. For others, it was built around being the smart one, or the one who never causes any trouble. Somewhere early on, mistakes weren't treated as normal, everyday parts of simply being human. Instead, mistakes were treated as evidence that something was deeply wrong with them as a person. Many people unknowingly carry that early belief straight into their adult relationships, friendships, and careers. If a mistake once meant you were bad, admitting a mistake now feels dangerous, not simple at all. It stops feeling like ordinary accountability and starts feeling like a direct threat to their whole identity. So the mind does exactly what it was built to do in moments like this one. It protects, often without asking permission and often without the person even noticing it's happening. It protects by deflecting, by minimizing, by quickly changing the subject before guilt can settle in. Sometimes it protects by getting quiet, sullen, or slightly cold until the whole topic just fades away. None of this is usually a conscious decision made calmly in the moment it happens. It happens faster than that, almost like a reflex, the same way a hand pulls back from heat. The nervous system reads the apology as danger long before the rational mind gets a say. That's part of why logic rarely works in these moments, no matter how gently it's offered. You can't reason someone out of a reaction their body decided on years before you even met them. But that's only where this particular story really begins to get interesting. There's another layer underneath that most people never stop long enough to notice, and it has less to do with the moment itself and more to do with everything that came before. This pattern almost never starts in adulthood, even though that's usually when we first notice it. It usually starts much earlier, often in childhood, long before anyone had the words for it. Some people grew up in homes where mistakes were met with punishment, ridicule, or cold silence. A child who spills a glass of milk and gets yelled at learns something important that day. Even if no one says it directly, the lesson lands clearly that errors are dangerous territory. Over time, that same child can grow into an adult who can't separate two very different ideas. They can't separate "I did something wrong" from the much heavier belief "I am something wrong." Other people grew up watching apologies get used almost like weapons instead of genuine repair. Maybe a parent said "I'm sorry" constantly, but nothing about the actual behavior ever really changed. Over time, the word itself became hollow, completely disconnected from any real sense of repair. And some people simply never saw an apology modeled in their home at all, not once. No one ever showed them what it looks like to say "I hurt you" calmly and directly. No one showed them how to admit fault without falling apart or exploding into shame afterward. For some, the pattern is tangled up with an old fear of being abandoned or replaced. If mistakes once led to being pushed away, admitting one now can feel like inviting that same rejection. For others, it's tied to being the family's steady one, the person who always had it together. Cracking that image, even for a single sentence, can feel like letting everyone down at once. And for some people, it isn't about their own childhood at all, but about identity and status. They built their sense of self around being right, competent, or in control, and rarely questioned it. An apology in that world doesn't feel like humility, it feels like handing someone a weapon. This doesn't necessarily mean someone is a bad or unfeeling person deep down inside. Often, it's simply the way they learn to protect themselves, built from lessons no one consciously chose, which explains why for these people, an apology can feel like standing in front of a firing squad they quietly built inside their own mind years earlier. So what do you actually do with all of this the next time it happens to you? The next time someone struggles to apologize to you, try noticing instead of reacting right away. Notice whether their defensiveness is really about you or about something much older than this moment. Pause for a second before deciding what their silence actually means about you or the relationship. Ask yourself what might be happening underneath the surface in that quiet, private space they're protecting.
Are they defending their ego right now, or protecting a much older wound instead? This doesn't mean you have to accept poor treatment just because you understand where it comes from. Understanding someone's fear is never quite the same thing as excusing harmful behavior towards you. It simply means you can respond from a place of clarity instead of pure confusion. Sometimes, gently naming the pattern without blame can open a door that anger never could. You might say something as simple as, "I notice it's hard for you to say sorry." That single sentence, said calmly, can land very differently than an accusation ever would. It also helps to separate what you need from what you're waiting on them to offer. You might need acknowledgement, but you might also need to protect your own peace, regardless of their response. Waiting for someone to become emotionally ready before you take care of yourself rarely works out well. You can hold both truths at once: compassion for their history and honesty about your own limits. This same invisible pattern shows up in places far beyond arguments about bills or broken plans. It shows up in friendships that quietly end because neither person could ever say, "I was wrong." It shows up at work, where entire teams stay stuck in tension because admitting fault feels like losing status. It shows up across whole families, passed down quietly from one generation to the very next. No one along the way ever learned that a mistake and a person's worth are separate things. It even shows up in how we talk to ourselves after we mess something up privately. Some of us treat our own errors the exact same way, with harshness instead of understanding. It shows up in how nations and institutions handle their own history, sometimes for generations. Acknowledging harm on a large scale runs into the very same fear, just at a bigger volume. It shows up in the small ways we avoid saying "my bad" over minor everyday things: a missed text, a late arrival, a forgotten favor, all quietly slide past without a single word. None of these moments feel significant on their own, yet together they shape how safe people feel around us. Even in our own lives, sometimes we catch ourselves doing this exact thing to other people. We deflect, we justify, and we change the subject right before guilt has a chance to land. Understanding this pattern isn't only about the other people in our lives and their behavior. It's also about noticing where we quietly do the same thing ourselves without ever meaning to. Understanding people doesn't mean excusing every single thing they've ever done to hurt you. Someone's fear of feeling worthless doesn't erase the real hurt they've caused you along the way. It doesn't mean you owe them endless patience or unlimited access to your time and energy. But sometimes awareness alone changes how an entire moment feels, even without changing the outcome itself. An apology was never really about two simple, small words strung together in a sentence. It was always about someone choosing to feel small for a moment, without believing they truly are small. The biggest shift usually begins the exact moment an invisible pattern like this one finally becomes visible.
And once you can see it clearly in others, and sometimes in yourself, you rarely go back to not seeing it. Every relationship in your life is, in some quiet way, shaped by how mistakes get handled inside it. Not perfectly and not without friction, but honestly, in a way that leaves room for repair. That's a small, ordinary kind of courage, and it's rarer than most of us realize. It doesn't require perfect words, only the willingness to stop protecting the story and just be honest. If this perspective helped you see something a little differently today, consider subscribing for more conversations like it. Thank you for spending these quiet moments with me, and I'll see you in the next one.